You are listening to From Embers, a weekly show on CFRC 101.9 FM about anarchist and anti-authoritarian ideas and practice. We are broadcasting from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples on land that has come to be called Kingston, Ontario, Canada, because of the thievery and brutality of the Canadian state and its empire-loving parents. From Embers is about fires, some real and some metaphorical. Fires started generations ago and tended to over the years. Little sparks all across this territory that we hope will grow, spread, and engulf the thieving state called Canada and the capitalist system that has plagued this land since the fur trade. As anarchists, we are against countries and borders. But what does that even mean? What would it actually look like if people were truly free to move around as they please, and yet not forced to leave their homes because of war, environmental destruction, or poverty? And how would we ever get from here to there? Today on From Embers, we're going to look closely at a few people who have responded to the recent influx of refugees moving north from the United States, especially in Southern Quebec. We'll talk about the ways these people are opposing and defying the Canada-US border and offering support to refugees in a political moment when a large number of people are trying, and sometimes failing, to migrate across the imaginary line that separates Justin Trudeau's Canada from Donald Trump's America. I'm going to start us off by reading you a recent call from Solidarity Across Borders, a Montreal-based group that focuses on borders and migrant justice. In the past year, tens of thousands of people have entered Canada from the United States on foot, seeking a safe haven. Every day, more people are arriving. This phenomenon is often referred to Trump, but it must be understood in the global context. Worldwide, more than 21 million people have been forced to leave their homes because of wars, political oppression, military violence, climate change, conditions created by imperialist states like Canada and the United States. Although directly involved in the economic and social devastation throughout the Middle East, Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia, the Canadian state presumes to limit who can enter and who can legally stay. Rejecting the racist and Islamophobic mainstream narrative and media coverage around those migrating, Solidarity Across Borders calls for open borders, radical solidarity with and mutual aid among migrants, solidarity cities, an end to deportation, immigration, detention, and double punishment, and an inclusive and ongoing regularization process. Status for all now. Global apartheid. Borders play a crucial role in the capitalist system and its quote-unquote migrant crisis. Canada and the US are founded on the theft of Indigenous lands and the ongoing genocide and displacement of Indigenous peoples. These borders, originally established by colonial wars to benefit European colonizers, are also a means to control migration. They prevent people from leaving violence, poverty, and exploitation, drive families from country to country, force them to board dangerous boats and make long treks across deserts and snow. Borders push people into precarity without legal status, criminalizing them. Borders keep the global apartheid system in place. No more case by case. Refugees coming from the US to Quebec and Canada have had no choice but to cross irregularly at Roxham Road and other ad hoc points of entry since the Safe Third Country Agreement came into effect in 2004. This agreement between Canada and the USA prevents migrants from making refugee claims at a regular Canadian border post if they come from the United States, and vice versa. This means migrants entering Canada from the US can only make a refugee claim if they first cross irregularly. This policy has already taken the lives of migrants and caused others to lose legal status or be deported. We honor the memory of Mavis Otutaya, who died in June 2017. Those who arrive in Canada are encouraged to put their efforts and hopes into their individual cases, trying to prove that they are real refugees or good immigrants. This lengthy bureaucratic fight is isolating and takes energy away from collective struggle. Moreover, in the last few years, on average, 40% of inland refugee claims were refused. There may be an even higher rate of refusal for people crossing irregularly because many have little support in making their claims, and because some have been outside their country of citizenship for many years. Soon, many will be refused as refugees and face a choice: stay in Canada without papers or be deported to their country of citizenship. The Canadian refugee system will thus smoothly deal with the problem outside of the media spotlight, judge people individually, and then, quietly, one by one, deport or criminalize many thousands. Rejecting racist divisions. Mainstream discourse and media coverage feed divisions among social groups who should be allied against the unjust global distribution of wealth and power. At best presenting the issue as humanitarian rather than political, mainstream discourse hides the role that borders play in maintaining that unequal distribution. The way that Canada has contributed to pushing people out of their homes in the first place is never mentioned. The far-right discourses of groups such as La Meute and Storm Alliance are emboldened by the normalization of Islamophobic and racist attitudes by mainstream media, politicians, and the state. By declaring that they are only against illegal immigrants, these far-right groups attempt to convince others that migrants crossing irregularly are criminals. Playing into long-held racist and Islamophobic European fears of black and brown men, far-right groups across Europe, the US, Canada, and Quebec spread confusion and fear about an invasion and terrorists and encourage the state to expand border enforcement and the policing of migrants. In these ways, instead of the conflict being defined by a division between wealthy and powerful and poor and oppressed, both inside and outside Quebec and Canada, it is defined by a division between people inside Quebec or Canada, fighting to keep social programs, but only for us, and people outside or newly arriving, portrayed as competitors for scarce resources, line jumpers, security threats, etc. Call to action. We support the freedom of all migrants to stay, to move, to return. Specifically, we support migrants in the United States, whether they choose to fight to stay in the US or to cross any way they can into Canada. In the face of the case-by-case approach imposed by the state, we must take collective action and support each other. As we oppose anti-migrant propaganda and these fabricated divisions, we must build concrete solidarity. Actions we can take in our communities. Everywhere in Canada. Organize or join mobilizations demanding that Canada ditch its case-by-case approach and instead implement an immediate regularization program for all border crossers and all undocumented people already in Canada. Challenge the government with public campaigns, forums, and the media about its safe third country policy. Service organizations, join your local sanctuary or solidarity city campaign to offer services to all, regardless of status, and to never allow CBSA access. In border areas, get organized with your neighbors on both sides of the border. Put up signs showing that you support people crossing. If you see people crossing, offer them support in the way they want, and do not call the RCMP or other police unless the people crossing ask you to do so. Explore areas along the border and help set up the infrastructure to support people to cross safely and freely. In Quebec, join the mobilization to oppose the racist anti-immigrant rally called by extreme right groups on the 19th of May at Roxham Road. Support mobilizations demanding that Quebec automatically issue a work permit for all who enter and for all undocumented people already in Quebec. Join the activities against the G7 summit, including the anti-borders contingent in the main march on June 7th. Join the anti-border caravan being organized by Solidarity Across Borders from the 29th of June to the 1st of July in Montreal. Offer time to groups giving frontline support to people coming across the border, and make sure that those groups treat refugees arriving with human dignity and offer them the legal and daily support they need. Support mobilizations creating a solidarity city, including campaigns around access to healthcare, housing, shelter, education, food. Join efforts demanding that Mayor Plante come together on Coderre's completely unfilled promise to make Montreal a sanctuary city by ending all cooperation between the police and CVSA. Join and support mobilizing to bring undocumented community organizer and Montrealer Lucy Granados, deported on the 13th of April, back to Canada. And generally support the courageous non-status women's collective. Support mobilizing for and come out in numbers to the Open the Borders Status for All March on June 16th. In general, we call for effective, non-hierarchical, and inclusive grassroots organizing based on mutual aid and radical solidarity, using a diversity of tactics and direct action to strengthen community resistance to border controls in our cities, fight deportations and detentions, defeat the fascist movement, and actively support anti-colonial struggles and Indigenous sovereignty.
Yo no crucé la frontera nos cruzó, mis abuelos no descansan, tierra es tu guerra. No crucé la frontera nos cruzó, mis ancestros son regresan, espíritu libre, Abjachala, Abjachala.
We didn't cross the borders crossed us.
Acorralado, arriesgar mi vida en lo que llamas América. Mantengo vivo nuestro espíritu nativo. Con sangre tiñes cada estrella para tu bandera. La gente que te sirve sigue siendo calavera. Si somos de color tenemos cara de ilegales. No se te olvide gringo, tu piel blanca es de migrante. Entonces pon atención a lo que viene y detente. Abajo el muro porque América es un continente. Yo no crucé la frontera, la frontera nos cruzó. Mis abuelos no descansan, tierra es tu guerra. Yo no crucé la frontera nos cruzó. Mis ancestros son regresan, espíritu libre, Abjachala.
A few weeks ago, I managed to catch up with Maura Kilmingham, an organizer with Solidarity Across Borders. She told me about the group's vision and about a couple of recent struggles against the Canadian border.
I'm a member of Solidarity Across Borders, Moira Kilmanum, and yeah.
Great. And what is Solidarity Across Borders?
Solidarity Across Borders is an organization that's been around for about 15 years. We started in early 2000, came together as a coalition of self-organized migrant groups who were fighting, mostly fighting against their own deportations and for status for all. So we formed on that basis, and all deportations, and the detention of migrants and, status for all. And then we, more recently added on, a campaign or a demand or a call to build, a solidarity city, which is the idea of a city where the borders have been pushed out of the city, and the different levels of status that are caused by the immigration system and by borders are really based on solidarity and mutual aid.
And that would be the city of Montreal, yes?
Well, no. I mean, yeah, we're trying to make Montreal the city, solidarity city. It certainly is very far from a solidarity city right now.
So tell me about your recent call to action that you put out. I believe it was called Open the Borders?
Mm-hmm. So among many different campaigns and projects and activities that we have, we've been trying to respond to the increase of people crossing irregularly from United States into Quebec because of the Safe Third Country Agreement. So our Open the Borders call to action was trying to provide a kind of a template for how to look at this situation and to call people to action to support people crossing, and more generally to put that in the context of a fight against borders globally and capitalism.
Great. So would you say that Canada is currently a safe haven for refugees?
Well, people coming across the border are trying to find a place where they'll have more stability, or they've decided that this is a place that they would like to try to have more stability. And so that's why we wanted to support them in that choice, and that's why we are supporting them and offering solidarity and calling for other people to do that as well. People arriving here will quickly notice that there's a huge difference between the kind of image that Canada puts out internationally and specifically the statements that the Trudeau government made around the time that Trump first started introducing anti-migrant and anti-Muslim policies. Trudeau was making a lot of political statements about how Canada would welcome refugees, but on the ground, on the terrain, when people arrive here, the fight for justice and equality as migrants does continue, which is, again, one of the reasons we put out the call to action. It's not as soon as people step across the border that they find a country of rights or justice.
What has changed for your group and the people you support since the Trump election?
The basic struggle has not changed. The intensity of and the room for people to express xenophobic and anti-immigrant sentiment, specifically Islamophobia and hatred, I think has increased. So the stakes seem higher and the fight seems more intense. There's been just a huge amount of hatred and racism that can now be publicly expressed that in the past was more difficult to proclaim publicly. So that's part of the Trump effect, I would say. Obviously, people crossing the borders have increased by a large amount. That has always been the case if people have crossed that border irregularly. But the volume of the numbers of people coming across have increased as people become more afraid, and people are put in real danger by Trump's policies. We've seen the Trudeau government not only not living up to the public promises that it made, but sort of helping in that criminalization process or that anti-migrant attitude by referring to people coming across as queue jumpers and other absolutely absurd designations. We've seen them as well collaborating openly with the Trump government in recent months to try to discourage people from coming to Canada and from giving visas to people so that they can't get into the States, so that they can't apply as refugees in Canada and so on.
I was going to ask you about this later, but since you brought it up, are you able to tell us about what happened yesterday at the border?
Mm-hmm. So some extreme rightist groups, notably Storm Alliance and other groups, have called for a march on the 19th of May. Solidarity Across Borders and other allied groups like Montreal Anti-Fascist began working together with local groups such as Bridges Not Borders to call people to for an Open the Borders rally to oppose the hatred and racism of the Storm Alliance rally. Storm Alliance had originally decided that they were going to call people to come to Roxham Road, which is where a large number of people do end up coming across. But because of our presence, they changed the location and went to the regular border post. We divided our rally into two parts. So there was a rally at Roxham Road, and then there was also a rally at the regular border post. The SQ, the Quebec police, prevented us from stopping the Storm Alliance from going directly in front of the temporary housing where refugees would be detained until they're deemed eligible to apply for refugee status, which is absolutely sickening. We can't know for sure that people were inside that building or whether they had been evacuated beforehand. But more or less that's
So, I mean, your group is saying, like, open the borders. This group is, like, build a wall. It seems fairly unlikely that those people that your hope is to persuade those folks with your message. What is the intention or goal in confronting far-right groups like that?
Well, I mean, many different goals. In this case, there was a goal of direct solidarity with people crossing, because they realized that that was a a strong and real, but still very small minority opinion, that there's many people who are supporting what they're doing and want to work together with them when they cross and struggle for social justice. So that was one, to send that message. A second, of course, is to send the message publicly. We did hold a press conference on Wednesday, and we spoke directly to the media about the rise of the far right and the importance of opening the borders. And so we were at the same time joining that public discussion, I think, in an important way. And they've been confronting racism. The slogan that's often used is "Make racists afraid again," and that is an important goal. That racists who Canada's built on racism, on white supremacy, obviously. So it's built in systematically in Canada, and there have always been people openly expressing racist ideas. But what's happening now is open organizing, and we're trying to push that back into a place where it's too afraid to show its face, and it's completely socially unacceptable. So yeah, that's another goal.
You are also openly calling for folks to sort of explore border areas, develop support infrastructure for folks who might be crossing irregularly. Some of my listeners might say, like, that's against the law. They should go through the official channels. What would you say to someone like that who's, like, living in a border zone but feels sort of like doesn't have the courage to sort of engage in that way?
Well, I mean, I think people should think back. I mean, it's a very easy analogy to draw, which people have often been drawing throughout this time, which is that border has, I mean, we can talk about that border historically as something imposed by colonial conquerors or colonial invaders, artificially dividing land that did not belong to them. So I would invite people to take a fresh look at those borders and where they come from historically and their purpose contemporarily as well, as a tool of colonization and part of the genocide of the indigenous people. And currently the way those borders are used to restrict flows of people in a way that makes them economically vulnerable and exploitable. So those big issues about what that border is and what it represents historically and contemporarily is extremely important in deciding how to approach it. And that might take a long time reading and thinking through those issues, but it's extremely important for people to understand that. In terms of sort of an easy analogy that many people have been drawn in these times is the Underground Railroad, of course, where people were escaping who had been enslaved and had managed to escape and came to Canada, where the legislation had already the slavery legislation had already changed and making it no longer legal to enslave people, or more difficult at any rate. So people need to think of laws as historical tools, perhaps, and put that in the perspective of thinking of the time of slavery and how people openly defied those laws because they either recognized that slavery was wrong or had just a feeling of compassion and justice towards other people. I mean, those are the kind of attitudes that can help you think of those actions as not something as illegal, but as something that's necessary and justified by the circumstances.
Thank you. What are some other recent campaigns or projects that your group has been working on, like more in the cities? Like, say someone's living in a city in Canada, they're not exactly sure where to start in terms of supporting this work. What kinds of things can you point to as examples?
So many things. What happens when people, either if they've crossed the border, if they've come in by some other means and they find their refugee status in Canada refused, Canada starts deportation proceedings against them. Many people at that point choose to defy those deportation orders and to remain in Canada without any kind of legal authorization to do so. At that point, they become extremely vulnerable, extremely exploitable, and in the status, the situation, the living situation is very precarious. So, one thing we've been doing in Montreal is supporting people who find themselves in that situation and supporting them specifically to speak out and break those barrier of invisibility and claim their rights as human beings and demand dignity and respect from Canadian society. Those projects are going on in many of the major cities in Canada, so connecting with some of those, and even the smaller cities. There are people living in these situations as well, so whether it's writing about this, if you're a writer, or if it's speaking about it with work colleagues or fellow students, or on your radio show. There's many different ways of talking about the specific situation of people who are undocumented in Canada, and then also the sort of tiered system where people have different immigration status, and with each different immigration status, different sets of rights, which not only keeps people, many people precarious in different ways, but it also divides people into different groups where they don't necessarily see a mutual interest. So building those links.
Do you have like an example or a story about a time that you find inspirational when people spoke up in that way?
Yeah, I can speak specifically about the situation of Lucy Granados, who was recently deported from Canada on the 13th of April. She was a member of the Non-Status Women's Collective of Montreal, a group of extremely courageous undocumented women who've been organizing together since Trudeau's election in 2015. And they've organized rallies, open rallies. They've been speaking to media. They use a white mask as their symbol, not only to protect themselves from being reported, but also because, of course, someone who's undocumented, any interaction with the police can lead to detention and deportation. So they've protected their identities by wearing a white mask, which is also a symbol of how they're pushed into this situation of invisibility. So Lucy Granados was one of these, was one of the members of the Non-Status Women's Collective of Montreal, who did do a large number of media interviews and spoke publicly at a number of rallies, including the big women's rally against the Trump at the time of the Trump inauguration. She spoke in front of all of those women wearing a mask, but very courageously. But that was a solidarity rally in Montreal, and many other occasions as well. So I just find the courage that she found, despite all the extremely difficult situation that she lived in at that time, and the dangerous situation she faced if she were deported, as she has been, was extraordinarily inspiring. So that's an example.
Do you mind talking a little bit about what happened when people in Montreal heard that Lucy was going to be deported?
Lucy was arrested on the 20th of March, and the CDSA somehow found her address. We don't know how. They burst into her home and arrested her extremely violently, and they brought her then to the detention center, where she spent the rest of her time in Canada. People began mobilizing almost immediately because many of us had worked and organized with her. She was at many Solidarity Cross Borders events. And Lucy was a very dear friend, or is a very dear friend, and as well as a comrade of many of us. She inspired us to so many actions. There was an 8-day sit-in front of this Canadian Border Service Agency, organized by a number of mothers who are migrants and wanted to show their solidarity with Lucy in that way. There were numerous pickets. There was a petition, obviously. There were letter writings. There were days of call-in, jam the lines for Lucy. There's a lot of art that was generated and circulated widely through social media in support of her. And then on the 13th of April, friends and supporters of Lucy did in fact go to the detention center and locked it down so that Lucy could not be deported. But that was the day that she was due to be deported. But the Canadian Border Service Agency actually brought her out the back door and cut a hole in the fence in order to deport her. And so she was put on the plane even while her friends and supporters were still outside the front of the detention center, and she was deported. So it did, her specific situation, the fact she was connected to many people, and the fact that she was symbolic of women who were demanding their rights and who are treated not just as second-class citizens, but as non-entities, who are typically the most exploited, work long hours, get low pay, vulnerable to sexual abuse, and there's nothing you can do about it. No political rights, no civil rights. And they had broken that boundary, and she was one of the ones who had broken that boundary and was speaking out. And that's why her situation, I think, caused such an uproar, and many people mobilized against her.
So what is the long-term vision of you and of Solidarity Cross Borders? How, in your most wild imaginations, if all your campaigns were successful, how do you imagine things going, say?
I mean, we're visioning for the for the impossible. So we are. I mean, our position has been no deportations and status for all. There's many people in Canada with a variety of precarious statuses, so we're calling for an ongoing, immediate regularization program that essentially removes status as an issue. Open the borders means that those borders that are dividing people and keeping them on different levels of privilege in Canada are removed. That is Solidarity Cross Borders' long-term vision.
And do you think there's a difference between saying open the borders and like no borders, like abolish borders? Like, is it possible to have a border that's that porous and still have like Canada and have the United States?
Oh, interesting question. No, I don't think so. Canada is a state. But is it possible to have communal borders that are somehow responsible with people? That's an interesting question. I don't know. I think it's worth thinking about, though. I think that's really interesting. If there are somehow borders that are accountable to a community, probably not. It's something that's different from perhaps it's different from borders as we now have them, which are state controlled and are in no way accountable to the populations that in the communities that live within those borders.
But you don't see open the border as like a demand that the Canadian state could grant.
I mean, the Canadian state could start granting that with an ongoing regularization program. They have something that they refer to as a permanent application for permanent residence on humanitarian compassionate grounds that former minister, the former Conservative minister, Chris Alexander, referred to as an ongoing regularization program, which does allow people who are undocumented to regularize, but after a long and very difficult process and uncertain as well. So that's not what we're asking for. We're asking for, calling for something that's immediate and ongoing and meets that respects people's dignity, which the current program does not at all. And that is something that the Canadian government could actually very easily implement.
Great. If people who are listening want to learn more about Solidarity Across Borders and the work that you do, how should they do that? How can they find you?
They can look on us at our website, www.solidarityacrossborders.org. And there's a lot of information there, including how you can get involved if you're in Montreal. A lot of information about things we do. It's a pretty disorganized website, but there's a lot on there, so I can encourage people to have a look. We do a lot of different projects and have over the years as well. Many very inspiring projects.
You're listening to the podcast edition of From Embers, a regular anarchist radio show based out of Kingston, Ontario. Talking to Moira got me thinking a lot about Roxham Road and about people coming in such large numbers to walk into Quebec from New York State. I spoke with Grace Bubeck, who lives near the Roxham Road crossing and is a member of Bridges Not Borders, a group of area residents who come together to welcome refugees crossing irregularly. So can you tell me what Bridges Not Borders is and what you do?
Yeah, so Bridges Not Borders is a group that came together last year in the summer because we wanted to do something locally. There had been the first demonstration by, at that point, La Meute and Storm Alliance at Roxham Road, and groups from Montreal came as a counter demonstration to Roxham Road also. Solidarity Across Borders and the Antifa group from Montreal. And we found that there was not much in terms of local presence. There were a few people from the actual area, but not that many. And so we felt it would be good to get together and just do something locally as a local group. There had been an activity already that had been organized by one of the Hemmingford churches. It was called the Muffin People. Basically, we went to the CBSA building in Le Col, where people waited to be processed in quotation marks by the Border Security Agency in order to start their dossier and their file as asylum seekers. And so we went there on Saturday and Sunday mornings, basically giving them breakfast. So when the Red Cross took over, because it just became too much and we couldn't handle it anymore, we were kind of out of a job. And so, quite a few people in the group were already with the Muffin People. And so we just got together and we said, well, what could we do locally? And the first thing we did was at a local arts and crafts show, which is actually taking place on a farm on Roxham Road. We had a table and we just put some information together about, countries where refugees come from, why they're leaving. We had an information sheet about the Safe Third Country Agreement, which forces people to cross irregularly if they are to be assured to make a claim for asylum. So basically this was like a first step to just provide information for people. And subsequently we decided on basically 3 areas of activity that we wanted to engage in. One was the political lobbying. The second was the basically sharing information, because there's so much misinformation out there. Our third activity is to actually go to the border once a week on Sundays, and we're there. I should explain, on the Canadian side, there actually is no access to refugees, to people crossing the border, because they get arrested by the RCMP, and then they get taken to La Colle for further processing. So the Canadian side is basically blocked off from people. So what we do is we go to the American side of the border and we come up to the end of Roxham Road on the American side, and this is where the taxis arrive with people who've come either by bus or by plane or by taxi. And people get, they come out of the taxis there, and then they take their suitcases and whatever they've brought, and they cross. And so we were there in the winter handing out gloves and mittens and scarves and just warm things, because a lot of people weren't necessarily equipped for Canadian winter. And we just say to people, we're Canadians, and we want them to know that they're welcome in Canada, and we wish them good luck. Something like that. Everybody has their own things they say, but it's just really, we just wanted there to be a welcoming presence. We get questions from people, when we greet them. They ask things like, will we be handcuffed, or are they going to be, are we going to be okay? And we say, yeah, you'll be okay, and no, usually you're not handcuffed unless you actually resist being arrested. Our group is not so much a political group, it's more a humanitarian group. We're really just wanting to know people who come across the border, that there are people in Canada who are happy that they're coming and who wish them well. That's really what we're doing. And other than that, we're trying to inform our fellow and sister citizens about what's happening and put information out there that's true.
And what has the response been like to your work in your local community?
I mean, in every community, there's people who are open to refugees and there are people who are not. Part of our work has been, that's the information sharing part. Like, we organized an information meeting in Hemmingford about refugees. And our intention was really for people to come to this meeting who are not already convinced, who are kind of wondering what this is all about, and for them really to find out more information. And we had 2 refugees actually talking to people about their journey, where they come from, why they decided to leave. And there's nothing as powerful as actually talking to people whose experience is written on their faces. These are not easy lives. These are difficult lives, and you really see that. You hear that. You can feel it if you're in the same room with them, and that's what touches people. So. We're hoping to do more of that, but at the moment, because of all the right-wing protests on Roxham Road, there was one yesterday, there was one 2 weeks ago, we also feel we want to be a presence there.
Do you think that the far-right activity at the border is having an impact on refugees crossing?
I doubt that very much. Because people who come, they're very determined. What has more of an impact, to be very honest with you, as far as I can see, is when the Canadian government decides to send people to these communities or these countries to tell them that they're not guaranteed to get refugee status. Like recently, that's happened with Nigeria, because there were a lot of Nigerians crossing. And last year it was the same with the Haitian community. So, and there is a lot of misinformation circling in those communities too, they think just because they get across the border, that's it, they can stay, and that's not true, and that's a whole different issue. It's like, how are their how are their claims for asylum? How are they processed? And are they? What kind of evidence is admissible? It's not an easy process, and nobody is guaranteed asylum just because they're in Canada. And so. That's the reality they're facing, and when after this government initiative in Nigeria, it's been very noticeable. There's been a lot less Nigerians come. If you look at the statistics from the Canadian Refugee Board as to how many of the actual claims are successful, it really depends. For the Haitians, a lot of claims are not successful, and the same is true for the Nigerians. If you actually look at the figures, which doesn't mean they don't have a claim. It just means it's not recognized.
Yeah. So. You go to the border, you greet people. Can you tell me a bit about what a typical day at the border looks like? Like maybe not last Sunday. I know Faith Goldie was there. You were probably quite overrun with, I would guess, right-wingers. But on a quieter day, on a more typical day, what is it like there?
We're actually not there for a whole day. We typically, what we do, because our resources, we're a volunteer organization, so our resources are limited. Just in terms of people involved. So basically, there's a bus arriving in Plattsburgh from New York at 3:30 in the afternoon. So the taxis from Plattsburgh to the border take about 15 minutes, 20 minutes. So once people leave the buses, they get into a taxi, and they come to Roxham Road, and or a shuttle bus. There's also, for bigger groups, there's shuttle buses. So we're basically there for about 3:30, 4:45, and we greet people as they come out of the taxis, as they, take their suitcases out, and they. Often we ask them where they come from, and some people just want to cross. They don't even, they're like so focused on crossing and so stressed that they don't want to talk to anybody. And others can be quite friendly, and respond and ask us questions. And so it really depends. But on the whole, the exchange with people at that point is relatively limited because they're focused on crossing. And sometimes, there can be the odd situation where people are really quite happy to talk, tell us a little bit about where they come from and why they've come. But we also don't want to ask too many questions because it's sensitive, and people don't know it's safe to talk to us. So some people just don't want to say anything. They just want to cross. Sometimes it's 3 people, sometimes it's 6 people, sometimes it's 20, sometimes it's 30. It really depends on the Sunday. There's other buses coming later on in the day, like there's one arriving in the evening. There's buses arriving in the middle of the night. There's also the flights, but less people come in direct flights, and more people come by bus. And we know a lot of things about all of this through our contact with people from Plattsburgh Cares, who, on their side, try and provide information for people. They have a Facebook page, and they have an information sheet that's now distributed to people even as they get on the bus in New York. We all do our little bit.
Are there any stories or days or anything like that in particular that stick out in your mind or memory that you think of when you think about doing that work?
Well, there was one day in December. It was actually the Sunday before Christmas. I wasn't there, but it was a very memorable day because it was a day when things really went awry in terms of the RCMP. There was a Haitian family, a woman with 4 children who crossed, and the oldest son, who was like in his early teens, for some reason, resisted and a police officer. Not quite sure exactly what was happening. It was filmed on our side because on that day there were 2 independent journalists there who were filming for a radio project, and so basically the RCMP proceeded to handcuff the boy. And the mother protested, and then they threw her to the ground and had to. And this was like, it was winter. The ground was icy, and she lost her shoes, and she was on the ground, and the officers were, trying to handcuff her. It was a terrible situation. We were really appalled by that, and that's really when our drive to try and talk to the RCMP became very urgent and very real. And to be fair to the RCMP, they actually have their inquiry about this incident. So that was one where we really felt, we need to speak up for the refugees here. We need to talk to the RCMP. We need to make sure that they behave in as humane a fashion as they possibly could, given that it's police, and given that they have their own culture, which is a pretty violent culture. So that kind of sticks out in my mind. In terms of people who come, what's really, it's not one particular person or family. It's really just that they are each so individual and so different. They come from different countries. They look differently. Some are very stressed. Some are relatively stressed, but kind of okay. There are a lot of children. There are families with small children. There's mothers with small children. There's single people. There's groups of people. It's a sheer variety that I would say speaks to me most. And the countries they come from change also. Like recently, there's been people from Angola, from Democratic Republic of Congo. I mean, that's not that recent. There's people from South America. There's people from Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Syria, of course. Every imaginable country, really. So you never know. You never know who comes in any one day. Who are we? We're so privileged, and that's really also one of the things that we want to say to our fellow Canadians and sister Canadians. We live such privileged lives, and for sure, some of that wealth can go to make space for people who really want to just have decent lives for their children, a future for their children. There's just so much hope in people when they come. And I'd love for that hope to come true rather than be quashed by a decision that doesn't recognize their refugee claim, their claim for asylum.
If people want to find out more about Bridges Not Borders, can you tell us where to find you on the internet or elsewhere?
Our website is bridgesnotborders.ca.
That's all I've got for you today on From Embers, your weekly anarchist radio show here on CFRC 101.9 FM. Thanks for listening, and as always, if you want to get in touch, you can reach us at fromembers@riseup.net. Thanks for listening.
الجليلة ومن نفر ولا من صحراء